Hello everyone, in this tutorial we're going to take the knife that we modeled and use the Arnold Render engine inside of Maya to create a nice still image render. We'll actually go ahead and do two renders, kind of a generic clay pass and a wireframe pass, and then we'll comp those in Photoshop. So when we get started, we're going to need to do some things before we can actually kick out our renders. We'll have to create a backdrop, set up a camera, set up at least one light, and set up our materials. So we'll look at all that stuff today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hide my reference layer and I'm going to turn the grid off. Okay, so let's delete the history. So if you go to edit, delete by type, delete the history, and let's freeze the transform. So modify, freeze transforms. So once we do that, let's go ahead and duplicate our knife because I'm probably going to position it. So I guess we could position it like once we get our backdrop and camera set up, and then we can always reset to 0. But I kind of like to have one that's not messed up. So I'll Control D and we'll keep knife, this one hidden. So if I select this, hit Control H, that hides it. And so now we have this copy. So I can call this one like copy actually. Oops. Okay. All right, and I think it's still in that layer. All right, so first thing we want to do is create a backdrop. We don't want to stare into the black void of space when we render. But even before we do that, I guess let's look at making sure that we're set into Arnold as our render engine. So right here we have our kind of rendering menus. And if I hit this icon, display render settings, you can see I'm already in the Arnold Render engine. So this is going to let me utilize the Arnold Lights and Arnold Materials. So I think by default it's like Maya software. So just make sure you come in, set it to Arnold Render engine. And then if you can't see the Arnold renderer, you might have to make sure you installed it. When you installed Maya, you can install it separately. It's a plugin, and you might need to make sure you load the plugin. So to make sure the plugin's loaded, you go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and it's one of these. I think it's this one. No, that's not it. It's somewhere in here. Mine's already checked, so I think maybe if we type in Arnold, no, it has a weird name. Maybe it's like AI. No, that's not it. So yeah, this is where you go to make sure like plugins are enabled though. So you would want to go in and just make sure that it's enabled. And you can probably do a quick Google search to see what it should be called in this list. Okay, so with our render settings, we're set in the Arnold Render engine. So let's do a couple things since we're here. Let's set the output. So image size, we'll set it from 540 to HD 1080. So our resolution is 1920 by 1080. And I think that's good enough for now. That's all we really have to do right now. So Arnold Render, set the size. Once we have that, let's go and create a plane. And this is going to be our backdrop. Go to edge mode, hold shift to move up to extrude that edge, and we're creating a really simple backdrop. So right now we have this harsh seam, and if you have done photography or notice like a photographer like set up a backdrop and stuff, usually there's not this hard seam right here that's going to be distracting in our shot. So what we want to do is kind of smooth this corner. In Maya, we have something called smooth preview, and we'll select the backdrop and just hit the 3 key, and it does smooth that corner out. So yeah, we'll look at smoothing stuff when we get into sub D modeling. We'll look at holding edges and whatnot, but for now, just know that 3 can smooth it, and for this purpose, it works fine. Okay. So now once we have this, we can position our camera. So if we kind of position it, I think I need to drag this edge up. Might be okay though. Okay. So if we kind of position our perspective right here. So what we need to do is we need to actually make a camera, because we're going to do 2 render passes. We're going to render the clay, render the wireframe. So we want to make sure we have a camera that we can always go back to that's in the exact same position, so we can comp those 2 images together. So to get a camera set up, I kind of roughly position it. I'll hold spacebar, right click, new camera. So you can see in my outliner, it created this new perspective camera. So we can just call this one like cam 1. So we know it's our camera. So I'm moving in that camera view right now. So we don't want to lock it yet. We want to kind of position this knife a bit more interestingly. Right now it's not very dynamic, it's kind of flat, and depending on what look you're going for, that could be okay, but we kind of want to make it more interesting. So in my viewport menus, you can see I have this icon called field chart. So if we click that, this shows us our actual frame of our camera based on the resolution we did. So everything that's inside this grid is what our camera is going to see, thus that's what's going to be rendered. So let's kind of position it, and I'm thinking about composition. A couple things. I don't want the backdrop to show the end of the backdrop in frame, right? Because that's not going to look nice. You don't want the subject to take up all the frame like this. Usually you want to give it some breathing room on the edges of the frame. And I'll select my copy knife. We can kind of turn it and angle it to give it a more dynamic look. Okay. So I'm kind of giving it the same amount of space on either side, so you can see these numbers here. So 8 here and 8 here. I'm kind of blocking it between the 8 line on either side. You might want to do the same for the vertically. So we got 6. Well, this one's gonna be higher than 6, so let's drag it down just a wee bit, and I think that's gonna be good. 7 and close enough. Okay, but you can see here I have my backdrop. It's ever so slightly, it's in the corner. It's getting cut off, so we can just move the backdrop up a little bit. That should be good. So once we get our camera position down, we can hit this icon right here, which is lock camera. And now we can't move. I'm trying to pan and zoom and rotate, and you can see nothing's happening because I locked that camera. So if I tap spacebar, it brings back all my views. If for some reason you set this back to like the default perspective view and you want to get back to that camera, you need to go to Panels, Perspective, Cam 1, and that will get you back into the camera. So when we go to render, we're going to definitely want to make sure that we're in this view. All right. So we got the backdrop, we got the camera. Let's look at lights and let's look at how we can utilize the IPR, interactive preview render, to kind of see what that light is doing. That will help us set up lights. Yeah, so let's just go to perspective. So let's hit this, set it to perspective. Okay, and you can see our cameras in our scene. Excuse me. All right, something we can do. Let's go to, oops, oh, lights. So let's go to the Arnold. And really what we can do is like change our menu set from modeling to rendering, and that changes the menu set up here. But really, I typically keep it on model for simple renders because we can use the Arnold shelf, which is right here, and we have Arnold Lights. So because we're using Arnold Render Engine, you're gonna want to make sure you're using Arnold Lights. You don't want to use like the generic default Maya lights. I mean, you could, but these Arnold Lights are built to work with Arnold Materials, the Arnold Render Engine. So you're gonna get better results, and it should be a little bit faster too, because they're calibrated to work within the Arnold Render Engine. So I'll just click this icon here. This is going to create an Arnold area light. So you can see AI area light. So when you see AI and stuff, that's Arnold. So what we can do is let's turn on interactive preview. So right now the viewport utilizes the GPU. So if you have like hundreds of millions of polygons, your GPU can't handle it. The viewport's going to chug. What IPR is going to utilize the GPU to give you a nice preview render of what really close to what we're going to see when we actually kick out a production quality render using the CPU. So if I hit IPR, it's going to take a second. You can see, oops, how do you get rid of this? Did not mean to hit that. It's just, there we go. Okay. I'll just shrink it. So right now you can see, oops, IPR, there we go. And should chug a little bit depending on your graphics card. So you can see here as I move my camera, pan my camera and stuff, it's updating live in this IPR. So I use this extensively when I'm setting up lights. So right now I'm just in my perspective view to kind of gauge the light a bit better, and then I'll go into my camera view and dial in the light. So let's scale the light. I'm going to bring it up. So for this one, we're only going to use one light, but we can get fancy with the lights. We'll do that later. So you can see here, like, it's pretty dark. Like, you can't even really see what's going on here. So if I have the light selected and I go to Attribute Editor, something that helps is, like, obviously we could bump up the intensity, but sometimes that's not enough and you still get this really dark result. So if you uncheck this normalize setting, this is easier to play with, in my opinion, than just cranking up the intensity. And really what we should do is make sure our scene is to scale. Since this is just a simple prop and it's a demo, I didn't make sure the knife was like to scale with an actual size knife. But definitely if we were going to bring this prop into like a game engine or whatever, you're going to want to make sure it's properly scaled, and that will actually help solve some lighting solutions because you'll be closer to real world scale. These lights are trying to simulate real life, so you want to just make sure stuff's to actual size so the simulation is close to simulating what it would do in real life. Okay. All right, so this is probably still too dark. My computer's chugging because I am recording and doing IPR. Oh, something we can do, because it's 1920 by 1080, that's also making it chug. So let's stop this. While I'm working on here, I can go to Arnold, or no, I can just click this icon right here, render settings. We know that like 720p should be the same aspect ratio as 1920 by 1080. So let's just bump it down to 720 for now. And as long as that camera frame is the same aspect ratio as the resolution we're going to end on, that's all that matters. You just don't want to mess with that aspect ratio because then your shot composition is going to be off. All right, so now let's do IPR. Let's see if it's a bit faster. It's still kind of chuggy. I think it just doesn't like me moving the camera. So let's move it to our cam 1. Okay. And why is this so far out? Let's go to stop this, close it, and IPR. There we go. So I just reset the IPR and now it's capturing the frame correctly. Oops. Okay, we're still recording. All right. So this actually isn't too bad. It probably gets too dark in this corner. But other than that, it's not that bad. Let's see if we can maybe turn. So I'm just rotating the drop box drop box. The backdrop. I'm just rotating that scene a little bit. And let's go into the light. So I can select the light here, go to my attribute editor, and we can play with the intensity. Okay. So I think what I want to do is I want to drag the light back actually. So I'm going to move this off screen for a second. Go to different view. Let's drag it back. And let's scale it this way. So here we go. So I think this is looking better. It's kind of really bright on my knife though. So let's drop the intensity a smidge. Let's go to 8. Yeah, I'm okay with this. That looks good. So you can see this is getting lost into the backdrop, but we're going to change the materials. So we're going to have to adjust the lighting a little bit anyway. So once we kind of get the lighting dialed in, what we can do is start, let's create materials for our clay pass. So I'll hit this icon right here. This is the hypershade. And this is essentially Maya's material editor. So by default, it assigns this Lambert material, which is kind of a Maya material. You can see it still shows up, but we're going to assign a Arnold material to it. So, and I use material and shader interchangeably. So let's go to Arnold, shader, surface, and we'll grab this AI standard surface. So if you just click it, it creates a node graph for us, and it also puts it up here in our material swatch area. So right now, let's assign this material to the knife. And before we do that, let's call this one matte for material, and we'll call this knife clay. Okay. So with that, select your knife, and then if you come over here, you can either do this in the swatch or the node graph. If you hold right click, assign material to viewport selection. So you can see this got brighter. That's because we assigned this Arnold material. So now we can start playing with some of the parameters, things like color. Maybe we want to be a little bit less boring and just give it a subtle, oops, I assigned it to the, oh no, this is the, you gotta be careful with this. I do this all the time. So right now I'm actually in the Lambert 1 material, which is assigned to the backdrop right now. So I'll select the knife, double click it, the knife clay material, and now you can see it's got this yellow border here, it's got this red and green border here. So now these properties are for the matte knife clay material. So now if I start tweaking this color, we should see the knife change in our view. Okay. So changing the hue will kind of separate it from the backdrop too. You don't want to do anything too crazy, so you want to keep the colors desaturated for this project. Obviously, it depends on the style you're going for, but while you're still learning stuff, just keep stuff relatively simple and clean. Once you get better, then you can go for like bolder statements and stuff. So I like this color. It's kind of boring. Let's keep that. And something that we can see is we're getting like this really shiny reflection. That's because we have a specular value in our material. We'll go deeper into materials and stuff a little bit later. So for now, this is just like a really quick overview. So roughness, basically, and it's gonna lag. So if I start bringing this value up, you can see it starts blurring those reflections. So the rougher the surface, the more diffuse the light is, the reflections are gonna be. The smoother the surface, the less amount of roughness, the sharper those reflections are going to be, because there's not like all this noise in our material to diffuse the light reflection. So I think we'll keep the roughness probably up rather high. Specular color's fine, we'll just keep it white. Let's bring this weight down so it's not as reflective. So I think something like this is okay. Pretty boring, but that's okay. For the backdrop, we could keep this Lambert. Actually, that doesn't look too bad. Or what you might want to do is just create another AI surface. Oops. I hate how it puts it on top. So let's just move this stuff in the node graph. Okay, let's call this one matte backdrop clay. Okay, so then we need to select our backdrop. So in the viewport, I just click the backdrop, hold right click, assign material to selection. Okay, so let's take out all the reflectivity from the backdrop. That will help differentiate the backdrop from the knife. So double click here. So we have our backdrop material selected. Let's set the color to, I think it's probably too dark. And it is chugging when I'm recording. Does not like that. Should be a little bit faster normally. Okay, so we just darken the value of the base color. Let's take the specular weight all the way out. And then it doesn't really matter what the roughness is because you took all the specular weight out. And I'll refer to specular as reflectivity usually. All right. So boring, but it's clean, and it looks pretty good. So we got our materials, we got our light. So let's go ahead and kick out this render. And then we'll come back, create our wireframe material, and then do another render. So I'm just gonna keep it 1280 by 720, but this is where you would want to go and set it to 1920 by 1080. And then what we can do is hit this icon right here, render the current frame. And what this is going to do is use the CPU and kick out like a production render. So right now you can see our shadows pretty noisy. Fixing this is going to increase render times, but we can do a little bit to make it a little bit better. So if we go back to render settings, go to Arnold Render, let's take the diffuse up, this volume indirect up, and the camera AA up. So these are going to increase render time. So if we hit render, you'll notice it's going to take a little bit longer. And each one of these squares represents like a core of your CPU working on a bucket of the frame. But you can see our shadows a little bit better. So I think I'll keep it there for now. Let's go ahead and save this out. So we can go to File, Save Image. Oops, let me see something real quick, because you guys are gonna get this issue, I'm guessing. So File, Save Image, and I'll just save it on the desktop and we'll call it Clay. So if we navigate to our desktop, this is the image that it saved. You can see it's way darker than it is in our frame buffer. This is called the frame buffer. I don't think I mentioned that. So what happened was, by default, it's trying to kick out like a raw image, whereas what we see is a color corrected image. So we want to make sure the save is going to save like how we're seeing in the frame buffer. So to do that is very, very easy. So we go to File, Save Image, but you hit the settings box next to it. Instead of raw image, you do Color Manage Image. And then you hit Apply and Close. And now I'll just File, Save Image. We'll save it as Clay 2. And now you can see this is what we get versus this, okay? So it's really important that you make sure you make that little change so you can get this, okay? So we got that image. What we want to do is make sure, obviously, we don't move the camera view because we want it to line up perfectly so we can comp the wireframe on top. So to do that, we first need to create our wireframe materials. So I'll hit M. And we only want the wireframe to show up on the knife. We don't want it to show up on the backdrop. And we'll see it when we go into Photoshop, but basically what we want to do is get our image to look for the wireframe. We want everything to be white except for where the wires show up, where the polygons show up. That's what a wireframe is. It just shows our topology. And this is really good. You want to show your topology, especially if you're applying for modeling jobs, because good topology is key for modelers. So, all right, so let's create the two materials we'll need. We'll need one material for the knife so we can see the wireframe, and then one material for the backdrop that will just be all white. And you'll see why we want everything to be white except for the wires when we get into Photoshop. So I'll grab this AI wire, okay? And I'll call this one matte knife wire. So again, I will come right here, select the knife in the viewport, right click, and hold assign material to viewport selection. So if we set this back to IPR, you can see what it's doing. So right now it's displaying tries. We don't really want that. We want to see the nice clean quads. That's a lot easier to see the topology. So what we're going to do is double click this material so we can access its properties, and then where it says edge type, switch from triangles to polygons. You can see it update it, gave it polygons. So another important thing for the wireframe render is we need to make sure this backdrop is white. If it's not white, it's gonna darken our image when we take it into Photoshop, and we do not want that. So if we grab this AI flat material, let's call this one matte. My computer, okay. Let's stop the IPR. We'll call this one matte, backdrop, matte, backdrop, wire. Okay. And for this one, we don't have to do anything. It's white by default. All we have to do is select our backdrop in our viewport, hold right click, assign material to selected, and it assigns that to the backdrop. So if we hit IPR, we should see this. So I'm just going to render it out, even though we could probably save the IPR image because there's not a lot of noise, but we'll just render it. And we'll go to File, Save Image. We'll call this one wire. Okay. So I think we're done in Maya. We have our two rendered images. So let's hop into Photoshop, and I'm just going to drag over my clay, and I'm going to then drag in my wireframe on top. And all we need to do to get this final composite image, so I'll refer to this as the comp image because we're doing basic compositing techniques. This is as simple as compositing gets. You have two layers, and for the top layer, the wireframe, we're just going to switch the blending mode from normal to multiply. And what this does is it's going to keep the black pixels, but all the white pixels hide. So that's why in our wireframe, we wanted everything but the wires to be white, because using the multiply blending mode, white on top of anything kind of cancels out. So it's whatever's underneath is going to show when you have white pixels on top. But the black ones are multiplied on top of these pixels. So black will be there when you multiply it. Okay. So then we would just file, save this one as composite. And then we have our three images. We have our wireframe, our clay, and then the composite image. So that was a really brief introduction into rendering in Arnold. I think it's super helpful just to know like your way around the materials, the lighting in Maya and stuff. Just so you can kick out some decent images. This is better than doing screen captures of the viewport, right? So presentation is a big thing. So as simple as it is, it's way more effective than just taking a screenshot of your viewport, right? So yeah, that was all I have for this tutorial. So I will see you guys later.